Welcome to the Sober Edge podcast, inspiration for alcohol-free living. I'm your host, Terry Patterson, functional nutritionist and This Naked Mind senior coach. The Sober Edge is a place to explore the infinite possibilities on the other side of drinking. In a culture soaked in booze, discover the wonder and joy of taking a different path. Meet real people living lives of purpose and passion, learn the truth behind the alcohol myths, and get ready to be motivated, inspired, and astounded by what is possible with the Sober Edge. Well, hey, everyone, it's Terry back with another edition of the Sober Edge podcast. And it is currently the very beginning of September as I'm recording this, September of 2023. So if you are listening to this in real time, we are at that break where, at least as Americans here, we tend to believe that summer is over. And it's a time we look back and we often have regrets about, the summer went by so fast. I didn't go strawberry picking. I didn't go paddle boarding. I didn't have time to do X, Y, or Z. And we come back with regrets and we wish we had done it differently. And we use these regrets to perhaps create a story about life moving so fast and what we didn't get done. And we can use it to feel less than, to feel disappointed. And so I had a conversation recently with one of the small groups that I coach, and the idea of regret became one of the key topics we talked about that day. And so I wanted to share with you some ideas around regret and what do we do with regret? Because I was one of those people who before, when I was still drinking and over drinking, I used to say, well, I don't have any regrets. And now I find that so naive and so shallow and so untrue, because the most important part for me of regrets is that regrets help us realize what we value. And so regrets are the key to understanding what's most important to us. When we look back, and it can be painful and a little hurtful to look back over things that we regret. And so we often want to avoid that. But when we do, when we allow ourselves to wade into the deep end instead of being so shallow, we can see that the things we regret most are those things that point out what we value and what we care about. And as I take women on this journey toward understanding more about ourselves in my self-experience, isn't that really what we want to clarify? And particularly if you are like me and you have been on an alcohol-free journey, part of the reason that I think I was so stuck in trying to change my relationship with alcohol is because I didn't know what I valued. I didn't have clarity around what was most important. And so if we use regret as a bit of a litmus test, we get key information that's really powerful. So I am not an expert on regret by any means. And so I am going to lean today on two thought leaders that I think are phenomenal and really do a great job thinking and talking about regret and why it's such an important part of growing as a human. So the two thought leaders are one of my favorites, Brene Brown, who talks about regret and the way it shows up with shame, the way it impacts vulnerability, and why it's so important to understand the nuances of regret. And she does a great job talking about it in her book, Atlas of the Heart. So I'm going to share part of what Brene has to say about regret. And then also Daniel Pink. So Daniel Pink is an author who's written several books, and he wrote a book recently called The Power of Regret, How Looking Backwards Can Move Us Forward. And he and Brene Brown had a conversation on Brene's podcast. And so I'm also going to share some of the takeaways that I had from listening to that podcast with Daniel Pink and Brene Brown. So first, I just want to share and enter into the conversation right where you may be. And this is the regrets around drinking. This is the thing that if you are here listening to the Sober Edge, that perhaps we have in common. And so why these regrets can be so painful is that we can look back and say, I regret the years I wasted drinking. Perhaps we regret our behavior while we were drinking. Perhaps we feel that we have impacted someone else's life and we regret having shown up in ways that were unattractive and maybe even damaging, perhaps for our children, our parents, our spouse. And so sometimes these regrets can feel very heavy. And it's the last thing we want to do when we are untangling this drinking and over drinking is burden ourselves with, what a horrible human I am. I have so many regrets. So just want to say that I hear you and I understand because that's exactly where I was. And it takes some intentional thought work. It takes some understanding and a lot of self-compassion to explore why the regrets are showing up and what it means to take a closer look at these regrets and bring them into an understanding of how they can help us move forward. Just like Daniel Pink says in his book, how looking back can help us move forward. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is Daniel Pink says that not having regrets is only possible if you're a young child. He actually did the research where children under the age of about 7 or 8 don't understand regret. And then the only other people that don't live with some kind of regret are people with a brain disorder. So you are going to have regrets in your life as a human. It's part of our makeup. And so instead of trying to stuff them or pretend they don't exist or laugh them away like I used to do, like I don't have any regrets, we can use these regrets again as a way to move forward. And particularly the regrets that feel the most painful. So I think it's really powerful to explore that with the idea that, of course, we're going to have regrets. And so we often don't want to process our regrets because it hurts and it can push our shame button a little bit. So Kristen Neff, who is the very powerful thought leader around self-compassion, she says it's important to face these regrets with the lens of self-compassion. And again, this is part of the human experience. So sometimes the shame comes from feeling like we're the only ones that did something bad. We're the only ones that did something we regret. And I think it's really important to understand that no, that's not true. This is part of being a human. And when we can accept that, it's such a beautiful place to arrive at. So one of the things we know about regrets is that we often regret those things that we didn't do more than the things that we did do. So failures of boldness, inaction, these are the things that we often look back on with the most regret. And I think it's fascinating because it's fun to see where we kind of line up as human beings. And so one of the thought exercises I want to invite you into is if you are still struggling on your alcohol-free journey, still struggling to unpack what would it look like and feel like to be alcohol-free, and do I even want to do that? I invite you to examine this through the lens of regret. If you use regret as a failure of boldness, perhaps you might be thinking, I'm just not, strong enough to do this. It feels really hard to take a break from alcohol. I don't know what it's going to look like. Imagine looking back and saying, wow, I really regret not trusting myself more. And that was me. Like when I look back now, one of the number one regrets I have around my alcohol free journey is that I didn't make the decision sooner. I didn't stop drinking until I was 55. And while it's never too late, I promise you that, I wish that I had explored taking a break in my 40s. I wish I had trusted myself more. I wish that I had taken that leap into boldness. And so inaction can be that place of regret. And so I want you to examine, if you play the tape forward, will you look back someday and regret not exploring your option to become alcohol free? I think that's a really exciting way to look at this alcohol free journey and just play around with it, again, with the lens of self compassion, but also recognizing that you are more powerful than maybe you have given yourself credit for. And then if you are on this alcohol free journey and you have stopped drinking and you now are in this beautiful space of new awareness and it's uncomfortable, right? What might you regret not doing at this pivotal moment? I have talked about this idea of creating space in the past, and I think it's such a really cool concept that when we have more space in our life, when alcohol is out of the picture, we have this beautiful opportunity. And so I want to invite you to think about not regretting this moment, but taking full advantage of it and moving forward with boldness to discover what now and what's next. And that's what my self-experience program is all about, for women to move into that bold action. Because again, regret comes from inaction more than it comes from action. So taking more risks can be a beautiful part of this journey. And so, as I was talking to this group of women recently about regret, we talked about the opposite of regret is reflection. Actually, that's probably not a true statement, but what is the antidote is probably more accurate to say. So, how do we sort of resolve the things that we regret? And we can do it with reflection. And again, when we reflect on what we regret and we do it with an open heart and an open mind and a sense of compassion and self compassion, it really helps us clarify what's most important, what our values are, and what we want to learn from the things that we regret. We also get to look at it from the lens of vulnerability. Along with vulnerability, being willing to examine our regrets is the other way that we kind of kick shame to the curb. So by examining our regrets, we can say, I'm stepping out of shame. I'm not trying to hide what happened. I'm willing to look back and reflect on what happened and why it was important. And so I think that's just another beautiful way we get to move forward as we do this work. Some people call this work emotional sobriety, but I just think it's just this beautiful opportunity to continue growing and learning more about ourselves. When I was creating the self-experience program, I looked at these 4 key areas of know yourself, grow yourself, love yourself, and be yourself. And so if we put on the regret and reflection overlay, this is how we know ourselves. We know what our values are. We know what is most important to us because we can identify those areas of regret. And as we grow ourselves, we can look at continuing to explore regret with a new lens, and we can have more of an openness toward, will I regret that if I don't take action? Do I want to say that? Is it kind? Would I regret saying that? Do I want to slow down and pause before I move into action so that I don't have regrets? This is how we grow. And then love yourself, really, again, using the framework from Kristen Neff of how we enter into looking at these regrets and this shame and vulnerability piece with self-compassion. That's how we love ourselves. And then be yourself. We get to arrive at a place where we feel more confident about living with regrets and understanding that, again, it's part of us as humans, and it can be a beautiful part. So I want to share a few lines and words and reflections from Brene Brown from her book, Atlas of the Heart. And I want to give her full credit because this is such a beautiful offering in the world. And it's an important offering. And this is what I shared with my group on this past week about regret, because, Brene Brown uses words so well, and it's so important. And one of the things she says is a quote, because sometimes disappointment and regret sort of get layered together. But a quote in her book says, "There are too many people in the world today who decide to live disappointed rather than risk feeling disappointment." And so imagine that level of regret. So she says, with disappointment, we often believe that the outcome was out of our control. With regret, we believe the outcome was caused by our decisions or actions. So that's just kind of an important clarification between disappointment and regret. And I think if we truly believe that it was caused by our actions or decisions, that might be where the shame part comes in. She says, "I firmly believe that regret is one of our most powerful emotional reminders that reflection, change, and growth are necessary." In our research, if you don't know Brene Brown, she is a qualitative researcher. And she says, regret emerges as a function of empathy. And when used constructively, it's a call to courage and a path toward wisdom. A call to courage and a path toward wisdom. I think that allows that. This is important work to do, right? This is why we don't want to just shove regret to the side, or we don't want to pretend, as I used to do, that we don't have regrets, because it's a call to courage and a path toward wisdom. When we understand the courage of looking back and clarifying our values and doing better the next time, and then that wise part of us that we can unleash. Yes, this is the work, folks. So she also says the idea that regret is a fair but tough teacher. And the idea of no regrets doesn't mean living with courage. It means living without reflection. To live without regret is to believe we have nothing to learn, no amends to make, and no opportunity to be braver with our lives. No opportunity to be braver with our lives. This is why I wanted to talk about this subject today. And this is what was so key when it came up in our group is, again, regret is not necessarily easy to look back. But if you are regretting how much you're drinking, regretting that you're waking up in the morning with regrets and saying, why do I keep doing this? What is this loop? Why am I not getting it? How can I get unstuck? I talked about that last week. But the regret of, here I go again, it's so painful. And so rather than say, I have no regrets or refuse to look because it feels painful, we're really fooling ourselves and actually missing the opportunity to be brave. Let's see. She also says, One reason we avoid regret is the fact that it can be accompanied by an element of self-blame and even guilt. But remember too, Brene talks about the difference with guilt is that it can, it's something we did. It's not we did something bad. It's not that we are bad. And so that's the lens of regret, is that we can look back and say, I wish I had done it differently. I wish I had made a different choice. And this is why. And that's where that very powerful reflection comes in. So Brene says in the work that she did with her researcher, she says, we find that what we regret most are our failures of courage, whether it's the courage to be kinder, to show up, to say how we feel, to set boundaries, to be good to ourselves, to say yes to something scary. And this is where I think I was stuck with the drinking and over drinking and feeling like I couldn't escape the trap. Because even though I was miserable and I had so many regrets, I wasn't showing up for myself. I wasn't being kind to myself. I wasn't stepping out in courage. I wasn't saying yes to something scary. I mean, I was stuck for many years because I was afraid to trust myself. And that regret shows me that today I want to be more powerful, more courageous. And I want to lean on the trust that I have now created with myself. You've probably heard me say before, because I believe this at the core of my being, that when we are drinking and over drinking, we lose trust with ourselves, because our no doesn't mean no and our yes doesn't mean yes. And that is a sticky place to be. And when we don't trust ourselves, we stop tuning in to our own intuition. And so when we consider doing something brave and courageous, we don't believe we can do it. We feel like it's almost impossible to move forward. And that is that place where we live in that miserable maybe, and we have regrets because we stay stuck. And so one of the things I realized from my own journey and looking back was that I wanted to trust myself more. And so since my not drinking days, which started almost 8 years ago, I'm going to be celebrating 8 years next month, I have really explored new ways to trust myself. I have explored ways to say yes and then believe that I have the courage to do it. I have explored ways to expand my intuition. And that comes from all kinds of things like journaling, gratitude practice, meditation, saying yes more, saying no, exploring boundaries, all of those things. I've realized that with the clarity of reflection, I know how important and key that is to living a wholehearted and beautiful life now. And so that has been one of the biggest gifts for me, is looking back with regret. I am now able to create the life I want here in the future. And do I still have regrets? Of course, because I'm human. Don't forget that. This work that we get to do together, and this internal work of reflection, doesn't mean we'll never have regrets again. But Brene talks about being able to use the framework of regret so that we don't live outside our values. And the more we live into our values and understand our core values, then the less likely we are to have regrets, or perhaps not to hold on to those regrets for so long. And this is one of the gifts of sobriety in my life. And I think for most of my clients as well, I've seen so many of you start to trust yourself again, start to look back and understand where you maybe took a left turn and you wish you had taken a right turn. And reflection is the key to understanding why we have regrets as humans. And so, yep, That's what Brene Brown and Daniel Pink have to say. So I'm going to put down this book and just wrap up this conversation because I want to give you an opportunity to go back maybe a few years, maybe just a few days, and explore what are your regrets telling you. In the conversation that Daniel Pink and Brene Brown had on her podcast, she asks him for his earliest regret. And often we look back and we say, I wish I had gone to college. I wish I had said yes to that European backpacking trip. I wish I had learned to play an instrument. But isn't it interesting that those types of regrets we can often reconcile and say, I could do some of that now. And so when we reflect, we can say, gosh, if I regret not studying anthropology in college, maybe I should take an anthropology course. Maybe I should go on an archaeology trip. Maybe I should just play around with these things that I recognize once used to spark me, and I regret not paying more attention because maybe life got in the way. And so when we create space in our life from giving up alcohol and we look around and say, well, what am I going to do now? What now? What's next? Think about this reflection exercise of looking back. What did you feel like you missed out on? Explore that. And then we often have this regret about not being kinder to people, things that we did where we felt like we disappointed or hurt another person. And we can look back on that reflection and say, what does that tell me about my core values? How do I want to show up in the world today? What opportunities are in front of me? And then when we look at our drinking and over drinking, one of the 12 steps, one of the steps in the 12-step programs is around making amends. And I think that is another way to reflect on those regrets. But we don't want to get stuck there. We don't want to use it as a place of shame because then it's going to be hard to do the work. So let's bring it into that beautiful work of reflection and ask ourselves, where would I have made a different choice if drinking hadn't been in the picture? And where does that tell me why it's so important to explore the role that alcohol is playing in my life today? So I hope that these thought exercises will move you forward on your journey wherever you are. I truly believe that the Sober Edge is a place to get inspired about what is possible. And I think with the beautiful work of reflections and regrets and looking back to move forward, all of that is possible for you and for me. All right. Well, I am so delighted you tuned in this week and have a wonderful week. And I will see you next time. Well, thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Sober Edge podcast. It's always my pleasure and honor to join you in this conversation. And one of the things that I have been working on recently that I wanted to share with you is my brand new guide, Stop Drinking in Your 50s and Beyond. You see, I was 55 when I decided to put down the drink and take up my new life. And I realized that the longer I do this alcohol-free living and the more coaching I do, coming up on 4 years now, I realized that many of us are drinking for different reasons, depending upon how old we are. And so I've created a guide called Drinking Through the Decades. And in this guide, it talks about the differences, whether you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, how we get tangled up in drinking and over drinking, and the number one lie we tell ourselves for each decade. And I really want to focus on inviting you into the opportunity to take a closer look at your drinking in your 50s, 60s, and beyond. I believe that the targeted approach is needed to hone in on those reasons we're drinking that look very different
when we're in our 50s and 60s. So if you are at all interested, please grab my free guide. I can't wait to share this with you. I hope it helps you explore what's happening in your own brain and your own life, and what is the story you might be telling yourself. This guide also has a link to get on the waiting list for my brand new program that will be launching, Stop Drinking in Your 50s and Beyond, Self-Discovery. And I am very excited to open the doors in September of 2023. So thank you again for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.